Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. In this installment, you'd better watch your elf. Lathril, Blade of the Elves, is a 4-mana 2/3 elf noble commander with menace. Whenever she deals damage to an opponent, she gives us that many new elf tokens. If we have a whole lot of them, Lathril can then tap herself and 10 other elves to make each opponent lose 10 life and we gain 10 life. Lathril's page is pretty elf-evident. With the infusion of new black and green commanders from both Commander Legends and Kaldheim, the ever-popular elf tribe has pushed well into the Golgari sphere, with Lathril swiftly taking the top spot among them. Let's get things started by loading up Lathril's average deck from EDHREC and importing it to the Archidekt deck building website. As always, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or help lower the overall price of the deck. There are so many elves! I hope you won't mind that I've split the creatures into 2 columns for the purpose of this video, to try and keep them more visible on the page. Tribal decks remain one of the most dramatically type-imbalanced archetypes in the entire format, where the high number of just one card type, in this case creature cards, completely dwarfs the numbers of other card types that can fit into the deck. Let's make our upgrades along the following 3 branches: mana production, looking forward, and utilitarianism. First up, let's take a look at that mana. Tribal decks are one of the best examples of counteracting good stuff deck building habits. Cards that are really good, if not great, if not format staples for the vast majority of EDH decks out there, can underperform in a tribal deck because those cards don't mesh as much with the exponential synergies that a tribal deck can pull off. Nowhere is that clearer than with this deck's mana offerings. We have cards like Arcane Signet, Harvest Season, and Cultivate, which I believe are all holdovers from the original Lathril Precon deck list. To be clear, I'm very happy to see cards like Arcane Signet or Cultivate printed consistently in Precons, to help keep the supply and price of those cards in check for the massive player base out there. All the same though, we don't need these 3 cards to help elves do mana things. From the odd mana dork to the beefy mana pumpers, elves have this whole mana deal down already. In fact, even after I remove these 3 non-elf mana producing cards from the list, if I'm counting correctly, the deck still contains over 15 mana acceleration cards, most commonly in the form of creatures. That's a really great number. Mana is really important to elves, especially to help establish early game consistency. So I'd actually like to get just one more mana dork in here that I noticed is kind of conspicuously absent: Devoted Druid. It's a nice and easy mana dork, but it also has some really explosive potential, especially whenever it's been pumped up by other elvish anthems. Additionally, let's look at this land situation. 32 lands is whoa. Like, I usually start my deck building with 38 lands, and sometimes allow myself to go to 37, but never less than 36. I like playing big spells, and I don't want to run the risk of missing land drops that would prevent me from getting to cast those. So 32 lands seems ludicrously low, at least at first. When we check in on other well-established elf commander decks out there, such as the famous Ezuri Renegade Leader, we see that a low land count is really quite common. The elves themselves are capable of such intense mana production that too high a land count would thoroughly disrupt their tempo. This tribe runs a high risk of flooding out, so a low land count actually helps mitigate for this. I'm going to take the cue here, and we'll just add one more land into our deck here to bring it to 33, just like other elf decks have done in the past. That's pretty short for section 1, but our elvish vision has already spotted our second section fast approaching on the horizon. Let's talk about this deck's relationship to card advantage in a section I call Looking Forward. As an avowed necromancy player, this section's going to be a little bit tough for me to talk about. Basically, my thesis is that elves are a tribe that is served better by looking forward rather than looking back. If our stuff dies, it's going to stay dead. The past is in the past, and we should turn our attention instead to what will come next. The card that really stands as an example of what I'm discussing here is Serpent's Souljar. When I first saw this card, I loved it, but now I don't think it's actually as effective for us after all. Buckle in, because I'm going to talk a lot about this card as a small example of an overarching strategy discussion. Where necromancy decks thrive off of resurrecting the same big, individually powerful creatures, tribal decks take individuality out of the question. While we may personally have some elf cards that we like more than others, in the overall game plan, no single elf is more important than the rest. Souljar, bringing them back one at a time, is kind of a grueling rate for a tribe that can take off so swiftly. And my mission isn't just to say that this card is bad or whatever, but rather to demonstrate its usefulness in comparison to other cards that could help us fulfill what the role of this card is supposed to be, and to do that, we have to discuss the overall structure of the Elf tribal strategy. Basically, our deck's play pattern almost always has us slamming a bazillion elves into play, each of them providing us with more mana and therefore accelerating the ability for us to play even more elves from our hand. Since so many of the elves will pump each other up, this helps us make very short work of our enemies by snowballing all those tiny benefits into a huge combative force. Hence the strategy's classic nickname, Elf Ball. With this game plan, we fill up the board very fast, but that also means we empty our hand very fast. At that point, if an enemy wipes the board, we could get stuck top decking for the rest of the game. So what are the ways we can mitigate against getting stuck top decking like that? Well, there are the classic board protection effects like Golgari Charm and Heroic Intervention, which help save our entire board from ruin. When well timed, these cards are a blowout, but these effects are also pretty rare. Then there's the other way we can mitigate against top decking to help get back into the game even after our board gets destroyed, and that's with the method of simple card advantage, refilling our hand. This is the reason green's card draw is always, or at least is supposed to always, be tied to creatures. Getting blown out by board wipes is supposed to be a huge weakness of a creature-based aggro strategy, so green shouldn't usually be allowed to just draw without creatures, because it would be too easy for it to claw back into the game that way. There was once a time where something like Collective Unconscious was one of the only ways that an elf player could refuel. And that spell is a little bit clunky, often leaving open a time window where the player can't cast it just yet and an enemy board wipe could annihilate the field, leaving the elf player with a completely dead card and a lot of regrets. However, in the past couple of years, Wizards of the Coast has apparently decided that green is gonna be primary in card draw or something, so green has often been able to work through that weakness without much problem in the way of timing. Where once Glimpse of Nature was a one-turn only affair, it has now become pretty much a mainstay effect for green. Cards like Guardian Project provide a very silly amount of consistency, for example, especially in a deck full with so many one-mana creatures. Ostensibly though, green's card draw is still tethered to creatures, Harmonize from Planar Chaos obviously being a color-breaking exception, and that does still leave us with the occasional time where our elves have indeed run headlong into a board wipe or otherwise lost momentum and we've run out of cards in hand. And that is where the color black steps in. Its relationship to card draw is tethered more to life payment and death triggers, which provides us with a lot more flexibility. A simple Read the Bones can be cast even when we have no creatures in play and will still draw us cards, unlike almost all the green card draw spells out there. But Read the Bones can also be used when we do have a lot of creatures and want to cast even more of them. That duality to draw cards whether we want to flesh out our board state or help us recover after a board wipe, that's a really big deal. It prevents us from stalling out when we're doing well, and it helps us claw back into the game when things go wrong. So with all this waffling about draw spells, I suspect you may be wondering whether I've lost the thread of this whole thing. Like, Joe, weren't you supposed to be talking about Serpent Souljar at one point? And my answer is yes, we still are. Souljar is supposed to help us survive a board wipe so we don't get stuck without any elves to play, but I'm not super keen on how it compares to the other options we have for that same role. For example, this card has the same inflexible timing as our board savior spells, but it doesn't have anywhere near their same impact. Additionally, the thing that we want it to do, help us play more elves, is also a thing that more card draw would let us do. Only those card draw options will also probably cost a lot less life points, and they'll also let us cast more than one elf a turn from our hand. And they can be used even when we're doing well, not just when we're in danger. At the end of the day, Souljar is not like a bad card. I'm not trying to be like, oh goodness, this one card is some huge problem. I'm just using it as a small, but admittedly thorough example to expand into a wider discussion on the ways that this deck can flourish. My experience with tribal decks, especially elves, has taught me that it is important to look forward, not back, because no individual elf is so important that it can't be replaced by another one that we could draw later. That's the beautiful thing about tribal strategies, their interchangeability and their redundancy. If we lost an elf that taps for lots of mana, drawing more cards will find us another really great mana dork. If we lose some elves that boast cool anthem abilities, our deck still contains a bunch more of them, so we can dig with draw spells to find them more quickly. So, Yeah, I'm gonna cut Serpent Souljar. It even kind of nombos with stuff in our deck like Llanowar Abomination and the Encore Dreadlord. So yeah, I'm cutting the jar and I'm gonna add more card draw effects. Up first, Read the Bones and Harmonize, two excellent staples in their respective colors. Then, though not truly a draw effect, both Elvish Visionary and Herald are also getting right in there. This small cantrip-like ability is a bigger deal than it looks, and it helps us flesh out the early turns to prevent us from stumbling. And finally, Skemfar Avenger and Species Specialist. These were especially the nail in the coffin for me when it came to cutting Souljar. If our army dies, I would so much rather draw like 7 cards and recast a bunch of elves from our hand on the following turn. And while I know Species Specialist isn't itself an elf, well, you know what, neither was a Souljar. Okay, I think I've kind of exhausted you with all of that. So let's get right to section 3 and talk about utilitarianism. I've said it a couple of times so far, but I want to reiterate something here that I think will really help hone the direction of our deck by realigning ourselves with the utilitarian purpose that tribal deck synergies can teach us. It's about the whole, not about any individual. And that includes our commander. When I first read Lathril's last ability, tapping 10 other elves to drain for 10 life, I was really puzzled. 10 elves can usually pack a lot more punch than just 10 life. They'll usually pump each other up to be like 3 power at minimum, and that can usually take a player down in a single attack when their numbers have grown to that kind of size. I'm happy to have this option with Lathril in case an opponent has shut us off from being able to attack successfully, like with a Fog or a Pillow Fort effect. However, thinking about the uses of Lathril's abilities does kind of make me glance a bit at the cards in the deck that I suspect put Lathril on slightly too big a pedestal compared to the rest of her compatriots. For example, there's a Seedborn Muse in this list, which I'm not 100% jiving with. It's good for giving us mana each turn, but elves rarely have mana issues on that line, and a 5 mana non-elf isn't the kind of thing we go for to help with that. Now, Seedborn Muse really seems like it's actually here to help us use Lathril's ability multiple times around, and I don't think that that's actually what we're really about. Like, okay, yes, that does sound awesome. But it also doesn't sound all too realistic, even if our commander can make some tokens. It's much more likely that we'll have 5 to 8 elves in play, in which case a nice traditional pump spell will help us dish out lots of damage too. More on that in a sec, but for now, Seedborn Muse is a card that mostly synergizes with our deck's plan B, so I'm not hugely invested in it. Let's refocus on Lathril's primary ability too. When she hits, she makes elves. The Menace is some good evasion to help get the elf ball rolling too, and there are cards in the list that are apparently here to pump Lathril up by a lot, such as Crown of Skemfar. Always nowhere near as much time here as I did on the Souljar, this feels to me like a classic example of focusing too much on one creature at the expense of the group. I don't like this card for us because I prefer cards that pump the entire team, not just Lathril. Yes, I know this effect can create a feedback loop with Lathril's ability. More elves means more damage makes more elves. But I still don't really like it because Lathril can still become very, very blocked. And more importantly, this is a dead card when we're set back. And most importantly, pumping up the whole team is more beneficial because mathematically that provides us with a greater damage output than just pumping one creature. And that is exactly what I want us to do. Pump more than one creature. We could use an overwhelming Stampede in this list to give the team some more oomph for an all-out combat brawl. Note that I'm choosing this option because it is the least monetarily expensive. I'd love to have Door and Banner and Coat of Arms or even Beastmaster Ascension, but those prices creep up. Play them if you got them, as always. There's even a Finale of Devastation in the main board that is also a really pricey card these days, and that is a terrific card in a deck that can make this much mana, so I will be leaving it in the deck. But again, don't feel obligated. Seriously, any fun pump spell to push a mass of elf tokens through for a lethal attack is going to work wonders for you here. Stampede is the one that I recommend for ease of acquisition, but any or all of these will be excellent upgrades to grab in the future too. Alright, you may have seen it coming already, but I also feel that we don't need Boots and Greaves. Lathril is not the only engine in the deck that must be protected at all costs. The deck has lots of stuff that it can do regardless of whether Lathril is even in play. Protecting our entire board is way more important than protecting one commander, so we'll be okay without their protection, and without their haste. Speaking of removal, I'm not really in love with how much mana Casualties of War costs. I just feel like this isn't really the kind of place that we want to put that much mana. I'm also not wowed by Null Mage Shepherd. The mana cost and the tap cost just feel a little ambitious. I'm happy to be wrong about this one, but the other pinpoint removal spells we're already seeing in the average deck feel to me like we're pretty good if there are any specific problems we need to address, so I'm fine with these things leaving the deck. Okie doke, I'll finish up by improving just a few Elvish offerings here and there. I know he just got reprinted in the Elf deck, but I am not excited to play Rhys the Exiled here. There's a reason the other life gain ability elves aren't showing up in this list already. Sorry, Rhys, I'll switch you out for a personal favorite, Dwynen's Elite. I like the double bodies here. That double body can represent a lot of damage when our Anthem effects get going, or a lot of extra card draw off of our death trigger draw effects like the ones we added earlier. 2-for-1s can be sneaky good in tribal decks, so give this one a shot. And finally, my last recommendation isn't some super secret gem, but it is an Anthem elf that I feel was left by the wayside. Elvish Clancaller from M19 is a bit forgotten among the many elf pumper creatures out there, but I really cherish this thing. The last ability is literally useless, but that doesn't mean the card itself is. It's a 2-mana anthem on a stick. Most folks expect the anthems to happen at 3 mana, not 2. I love what this card kind of represents for elves. This famous tribe is well explored through the years, so everything about them is already pretty well documented and well known. But there are still some lovely things to find along those familiar trails, and this is one of them. You know, I think that'll do it. This deck looks like an absolute blast, with a well-fueled engine that helps it maintain speed through every piece of the game. You can find the link to the list below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed this jaunt through the forest, and if you have any other recommendations that you think your fellow elven brethren ought to be playing in their Lathril decks too, make sure you leave those suggestions in the comments below. Namarie, and thanks for watching.